Perfect. Welcome back to the podcast. This is the 27th episode in, and I have a guest on today called Tim Pereira, which those of you who are based in Ireland, the UK, may know through LinkedIn, a lot of your posts of late. And yeah, I'd love Tim, if you want to introduce yourself. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I guess why we're talking today is in August 15th, I completed a 5.5 month journey walking across the United States from West Coast to East Coast. I really did it for myself, my own kind of spiritual, personal challenge, transformation, if you will, but also did it to raise awareness and money for men's mental health, suicide prevention, having gone through my own journey, my own history with things like depression, anxiety, and big life changes, identity shifts from corporate world sales to finding out a path after that, getting into starting my own businesses, now running men's coaching, men's community, throwing retreats for men, and that kind of stuff. So it's been really interesting to see this path start to merge from all these different angles and start to create a bit of momentum in this space, which, of course, was never, ever something I thought that I would find myself doing. But here we are, and we get to chat more about it.
Yeah, definitely. And what I'd love to know is what if something that comes top of mind before we maybe get into the whole podcast is there one thing that you'd love to tell the listeners that you've, I suppose, learned from your entire journey? I know we could leave this to the very end of the podcast, but maybe at the start, is there one thing that comes top of mind from the entire experience of maybe walking across America or?
You know, the thing that pops in my mind right now when you ask about is really the power of our mind and how it shapes all of our experiences. And I don't mean from a surface level concept of like mindset is everything that we hear. It's really one thing that I have really experienced, especially through the walk, is the depth and the nature that the mind really does craft our whole experience here on earth, from who we think we are, the life that we feel like we should live, our desires, our aversions, how we handle adverse circumstance, how we speak to ourselves, all of those things really start to create this recipe that ends up being our own human experience. So what I learned on the walk was just how to face that more intimately, how to face that at a much deeper level, right? How to expand my own awareness, how to not be thrown off by challenges, things like physical pain, my negative inner critic, also not how to be kind of lured away or attracted to desires or cravings or that kind of stuff, and how to find just the simplest truths within. And when I lived from that place, when I walked from that place, things became a heck of a lot easier. And stuff just started to happen on its own. Life has this way of magically kind of taking care of you. And it all comes back to this inner mastery, this inner work of discovering ourselves, reconnecting with ourselves, learning our fears, our insecurities, the beliefs that keep us small, the models that we have created mostly subconsciously or unconsciously about ourselves, about who we are, about how we're supposed to interact in this world, about how the world is supposed to react to how we're showing up, and ultimately how all of that stuff is what creates our suffering. And on the other side of it is our liberation. And liberation comes from seeing the truth in all that, seeing the illusion of all that, and finding this center within all of us.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Tim. It seems like a very, and I don't mean to use this word in a, not a throwaway word, but it seems like an almost a spiritual experience. If I don't want to use the word if I don't really know
Yeah.
what, but yeah, Yeah, it
Yeah.
seems you went through a transformation. Or,
I didn't go on this walk for a physical challenge or for an achievement of any kind. I knew obviously completing it had significance. It was a milestone. But the whole reason I went on it was because I was really struggling last year. I was dealing with this deep, dark, apathetic depression. The first time in my life I had thoughts of suicide. And I had tried everything. I worked with therapists, coaches, uh, super fit and healthy, eating the right foods, getting enough sleep, doing cold exposure, blood tests, checking supplements, like all that biohacking stuff. I even did plant medicines. I went on a more of a pilgrimage type of trip to India. Just was trying everything. I've read hundreds and hundreds of books, podcasts, all that stuff, and yet I still found myself in this space. And honestly, I felt like I was out of options. I didn't feel like there was anything that I hadn't tried. And so when the idea of the walk came across my plate, it was so obvious to me that that was the thing that I had to do. It was like I had I kind of describe it as like a lightning bolt going through my body. This massive flush of energy and emotion. And it was almost like I didn't even decide it. It was like, yeah, that's the thing I'm doing. And it was clear to me going in that I was to treat it like a spiritual practice, or like a sadhana is the word, which essentially just means spiritual practice. Just like some people wake up and they meditate on the cushion for 20 minutes, or they wake up and they write, or maybe they go to church on Sundays. Like all of these things are certain types of sadhanas. Maybe they fast. Anything really can be in play with that. For me, it was really clear to treat the walk that way. So what that meant was to walk 20 or 30 miles a day, no headphones, so no music, no podcasts, no audiobooks, no distractions. Sometimes I would take phone calls, from loved ones and friends along the way. I'm like, that was cool. I did that maybe once a week, so it wasn't that big of a deal. But no distractions. And I wanted to be present. I wanted to be focused. I wanted to treat it like a walking meditation. I wanted to try things like mantras, just saying things over and over and over, sometimes out loud, sometimes in my head, to go and treat the whole walk with nonviolence, meaning like I wasn't going to bring any kind of weapon. I was going to trust the goodness, right? The compassion, the nature of what I felt was at the core of every human being. And again, it was a test. I didn't know what was going to happen. And then the third piece really for me was to treat the whole walk with total surrender. Something I absolutely have never done before. But I felt like this was the thing that was going to save my life. And I was willing to put my life on the line to see if surrender worked. It's not like I'm recommending people do that. That's just the position I found myself in. And so it felt right to me to go into it with full surrender to something bigger than me, and trust that it was going to work out. And if it didn't work out and something happened to me along the way, I was willing to risk that.
yeah, yeah. Well, it seems like pretty profound what you've gone through. And if you don't mind me asking, we'll get into a bit about your background as well, Tim.
Yeah.
I don't want to just, yeah, I don't want to, yeah, but I'd love to know. You mentioned a number of things there, and were there stages where you wanted to give up as well during this walk? If you don't mind me asking, you
Yeah.
started from which state to which
Yeah.
state?
I started in California, in Southern California, in a town called Newport Beach. And I kind of went on a southern route through the U.S., more southern, through Arizona, through Sedona, through Taos, New Mexico, northern New Mexico, in the mountains, the Rocky Mountains there, which is beautiful. And then through Tennessee, and then I ended in Virginia Beach. And there was only really one day where I woke up and I was excited to walk, and maybe 2 days, and that was the first and the last day. Every other day I woke up, I just did not want to put that many miles, on my feet. My feet were just in pain and sore the whole walk. But I never thought about quitting. Like that wasn't, even with the strong inner critic and the thoughts that I had, I never had thoughts about calling it quits. There was just such a deeper level of commitment. Like I said, I felt like I didn't even decide to do this. So I never thought about quitting, but there were definitely days where I was sick of being on the road. Where I was dealing with blisters and body parts that were in pain. I would take a wrong turn and have to walk 13 extra miles. I was facing thunderstorms and animals and dangerous drivers and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, never had any thoughts about quitting.
Yeah. Yeah, wow, it seems like, and I don't want to, yeah, understate or overstate, but it seems like you really gave it a full commitment, and you really didn't leave any stone unturned during the whole entire walk. Looking at your updates, there were daily updates on LinkedIn, if you don't mind me asking. I think you
Yeah.
were,
Yeah.
yeah,
There was 1 week where I didn't write anything. I've wanted to be present with the road, and I was just kind of sick of writing stuff. But outside of that, yeah, I share it every day.
yeah, yeah, nice, brilliant. Well, before we get into, I suppose, any more detail, Tim, I'd just love to give a quick background for maybe some listeners in Ireland and the UK, and those maybe that are listening all over the globe and some countries that have popped up of late that may not have heard of you before. So I just love to give a quick
Yeah.
background. So you feel free to correct me if I got this wrong. That it says that's right. Tim Pereira walked 3,007 miles across America as a personal challenge and a major effort to raise awareness and funds for men's mental health and suicide prevention. Here are the key details about his journey. Distance and route. The walk was approximately 3,007 miles. Some initial plans estimated 2,800 miles, and we already talked about starting from Newport Beach, California, and finishing at Virginia Beach, Virginia. The cause: Tim's mission was fueled by his own struggles with burnout, depression, suicidal thoughts. He wanted to break the stigma around men's mental health, encourage conversations, and inspire men to seek support. Fundraising. He aimed to raise $50,000 for, and this is US dollars, for mental health charities, with donations going to organizations like Movember. Personal challenge: Tim made the walk even more challenging by choosing to walk without any inputs, music, podcasts, or audiobooks, using it as a spiritual and self discovery practice. Impact: through his journey, which he documented on social media, he aimed to reach millions of men and share his message that strength means facing challenges and seeking help, not suffering in silence. And then it states at the bottom, or it says at the bottom, would you like to find out more about his mental health coaching business, PE or wellness, or the specific charities he supported? Hopefully that's all correct, Tim. Or if good, if
Yeah, it's
it's
pretty good. There weren't any glaring inaccuracies.
yeah. Is there anything missing there you like to add, or
Um, I mean, yeah, I would say the thing is my website is now my first and last name instead of Per Wellness. But no, I think, it was a personal challenge. But more, as we already touched on, more importantly than it being a personal challenge it was a spiritual practice. I went into it seeking transformation. It really wasn't about completing, finishing the walk. It wasn't this big goal, I set out to complete it. And I think that's why it was so impactful, because every single day when challenges arose, I wasn't trying to avoid them. One of my mantras to myself was this too. This is part of it. Whatever challenges I faced, tornadoes, coming across a black bear, almost getting bit by a rattlesnake, not figuring out where I was going to stay, or not knowing where I was going to stay and having to figure it out kind of the night of. Those things weren't not part of it. It was all part of it. And so that was the practice for me. Some days were great and it was beautiful and weather was perfect and so many people came up and helped, but also the really challenging days, when I would be limping because of a blister all day long, or I couldn't wait to get to the hotel or the campsite or wherever I was staying. But every day was the walk. It wasn't, again, like this thing. I wasn't setting a world record. I wasn't trying to beat a time. I wasn't doing that. And so I think that nature really allowed me to be and forced me to be extremely present in a way that I'd never reached that, never experienced that depth of presence before, that oneness with everything. Time disappeared at times. I realized that mile 1 and mile 30 actually happened at the same time. And that was a pretty mind exploding experience. So yeah, I think more than anything, more than it being a personal challenge, it was a personal transformation pilgrimage. That's more how I think of it.
Yeah, yeah, wow. And hopefully this isn't taking away too much from the spiritual transformation aspect of it. But what was the initial idea and spark to walk across America? Was it something you always wanted to do, or was it due to the mental health difficulties that you were facing? Or
Yeah, last year, or in 2024, around March, I had the sense that something needed to change or something was coming. And so I just started slowly exploring different things. I thought about moving to Costa Rica for a month or two. I looked into going on a trip to India, which I actually ended up doing, and it was amazing. I looked at driving around the US and visiting different sites, doing plant medicine somewhere. Like all of these, I was looking at everything, and nothing really stood out. And I got back from India, which was a really powerful trip in itself. That was a pilgrimage in itself. And I saw a video of a guy online talking about how he had gone through a really challenging year. And he walked across America and how it totally changed his life. And when I heard him speak those words, that's when I had that lightning bolt feeling. And I was like, I didn't even walk across America. That's wild. I'd never heard of anybody doing that. And it was the day before Thanksgiving last year, which would have been the third week or so in November. And and it was just obvious. And then over the next couple days, I just became obsessed with the idea, and I was trying to figure out if it was realistic, how long it would take, how much money it would take, what it physically would require of me. And so the next 3 days, all day long, I just planned. And then at the end of that third day, I had a whole deck. I had this whole presentation about why, the route I would take, the goals. And I shared with a couple friends. I shared with, I think, 3 different friends, and they all had the same response. They were all just like, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. Like, this is amazing. You have to do it. And then I had about 3 months to plan from then. So that was about it. It was not something I had ever thought of before, about 3 months before doing it.
yeah, yeah, wow, that's 3 months is pretty short term to. Or did you find it pretty straightforward to plan the whole route, or did you use someone else's route to walk across and to get the charities all on board and the raise funds? Was it pretty straightforward, or was it?
No, I mean, the planning, I had a friend who's done a lot of backpacking, gave me some tips on gear. I found one article of a woman who had walked across America, and I got some tips from her on gear, but she took a different route. And there's no set route, really. It's not like doing these other trails that go north to south, the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail, the Continental Divide Trail, that kind of go north to south across the country that tons of people do. It was kind of the Wild West. And so I planned the general route, the main cities I wanted to hit: Sedona, Taos, Nashville, Knoxville, and then Virginia Beach. And then from there, I pretty much planned 1 week at a time. And so anything more than that I just learned was not super realistic to plan out. So yeah, I just planned about a week at a time. And then finding charities was actually really hard. I had a handful of calls with charities. There's not a ton of men's mental health, like legit charities in the US. Actually, there's more in the UK that I found in my search. And I had some really disappointing calls with charities. One that was really promising, and they just totally dropped the ball, never got back to me. And then I ended up getting in contact with Movember, and they were the most responsive, which was nice. But yeah, other than that, it was pretty much pieced together the whole way. Which is all you have to do. You don't have to plan the whole thing. That was pretty obvious.
Yeah, taking it week by week is a good strategy to go by, especially when there's so much uncertainty around. Did you plan out nutrition as well and food and place to stay, or was it very
Yeah,
much?
I tried my best. I mean, food is really hard. There's what we would call like a food desert, food deserts across the U.S., which is it's really hard to get any whole nutritious food. And pretty much everywhere you go, it's either fast food, McDonald's, Burger King, all that crap, or convenience stores, which also is just processed and highly processed, ultra processed packaged food. And so whenever I was around a bigger town, I was able to get proper groceries. But in these more desolate, remote areas of the U.S., there weren't a lot of great options, which was really tough because I was burning a lot of calories, about 5,000 calories a day, at least in the beginning, and it dropped a bit by the end. And so it was hard to get not only enough food, but quality food. So that was one of the biggest challenges. But I had a good sponsor. Jocko Fuel sponsored me, sent me a bunch of protein and electrolytes and creatine and stuff to help supplement. There were companies that sent me protein bars, IQ bars, sent a bunch of stuff out, and so I had some support. But it was still yeah, it was still challenging. I carried all my gear in a little running stroller, and so I could only have so much on me at any point. So food was challenging, especially in the Southwest. In the Southwest, there's so much distance between towns, whereas you start to get to the East Coast, towns are every 5 miles or so, so they're really close. But out west, you could go. I think the longest stretch I went through the desert was 94 miles. So that was about 3 long days of of walking without a building, without a gas station. So that was the longest stretch, but that was the one of the biggest challenges, especially in the first half.
Yeah, yeah, that's great to hear that you've. I didn't realize that there was so much. They're called food deserts. Food.
Yeah, it's just kind of the term for lack of quality groceries in areas of the country that just get highly processed. Like the only food they have access to is like freezer food or frozen ultra processed, comes in packages, like no produce, no meat, no eggs. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, it seems like yeah, it seems so just a bit different compared to Ireland, where I know it's a smaller country, but there's quite a lot of for those that are maybe listening that I don't want to make this about Ireland, but there's quite a lot
Yeah.
of centres or smaller shops that are around Ireland that you may be able to stop in. I didn't realize. Well, America's such a like a lot bigger. I think yeah, it's like similar population, maybe in Minnesota or an Alabama, maybe Ireland. So it's to
Yeah.
walk across all of America must be. It's just a different like you must have. And with when you were walking across, did you have somewhere to stay every night, or did you, if you don't mind, or did you go back to
Yeah.
your previous stop and
I kind of did everything. There were, especially in the first half, I camped. In these long stretches, let's say through New Mexico, I may have 70 miles between where I'm at and the next town. And so I got to camp a couple nights. And so I would just find a spot either on the side of the highway or maybe there would be a little rest area. There's a lot of semi trucks that go through those parts of the country. So there may be a little rest stop. I could set up camp. Maybe I find a small town where there's just a handful of houses and there may be a baseball field. So I've slept on a couple baseball fields. And then hotels, if there are hotels, motels, Airbnbs. I slept in friends' homes. And then there were a couple stretches where I had people come out and drive a support vehicle for me, which basically means they would take me to my starting point, I would walk, they would pick me up at my end point, and then bring me back to a hotel. So that happened sometimes. For the most part, I was solo though. So just finding really wherever I could.
yeah, yeah, wow. And we don't you mentioned that there was calories burned. Were you wearing certain devices, wearable technology? Is there any specific brand you were using or
My uncle gave me an old Garmin of his,
okay?
so I was using the Garmin to track, mostly to track distance. So I would track my walks every day and see the step count and mileage and whatnot. So it's hard to get calories exactly, but based on, my, uh, what I knew about my calorie expenditure before, my muscle mass, my height, weight, all that stuff. And then my estimated burn walking 50,000 steps every day.
Yeah,
Yeah.
geez, that's yeah, 50,000. That was, and is did you bring multiple pairs of? And I'll stop going into the maybe the logistics. This is probably the last question. I know maybe you want to keep going into it, but there's other things that I'd love to talk about. Shoes wise and runners wise, is there any brand that you wore to walk that distance, or is did you bring multiple pairs, or
I went through 9 pair on the walk,
okay,
and I used a pair by Ultra called Lone Peak, the Lone Peak 9. And I had a combo of their waterproof version and others, and their trail running shoes. Um, and they're actually pretty thin. They're also zero drop, so they're flat. They're wide toe box though, so plenty of room for my toes to help avoid blisters and that stuff. And they were great. They worked. I chewed through a bunch of them, or I should say the road did. But yeah, they worked. They worked great.
yeah.
Yeah.
Nice, nice. And I'd love to know, we're 26 minutes in. I know this is around 45 minutes, so I don't want to take up too much of your time today, Tim, but I'd love to know about the events leading up to the walk and maybe then a bit more in depth about the transformative experience and then after. So I'd love to know maybe a bit about just a small brief about your upbringing and then a bit about um, some of the events around men's mental health and maybe suicide prevention, if you're open to talking about them, that led you to this event of walking across America, if that's okay. Or
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I grew up in a great family, two very present parents. I grew up playing sports. I was a good student. Um, I got into college. I played sports in college, and then afterwards ended up getting into sales. Was just really driven to be good at everything I did. Became a top rep in sales. Managed a team, for a booming startup. Like all this stuff on paper that was good, that was great. And during the process, I had realized that I was following this path that I thought I was meant to be on. I thought it was the path that was going to make me happy because I had just been conditioned my whole life to think that success and achievement and accumulation meant I was worthy. And so that took some years to unpack and really get there. And also in that process, as I was moving from the West Coast to the East Coast, I was managing a team. I got out of a big breakup. I started to use the weekends to party. I would go out and just drink with friends on Saturday, and that started to become more and more, not just of a habit, but the one point during the week that I was really looking forward to. Saturdays were like my escape. And I did that for a few years before it really hit me. But what I learned in this whole process was how unable I was to understand what was going on in my inner world. I was so used to powering through, no excuses, don't be a pussy, don't bitch, like just push through. And when I ended up getting fired from my sales job for performance, as I had been slipping with depression and anxiety, and I was feeling more apathy and a lack of motivation, I just thought I had become a lazy person. And what it forced me to do was look inward. And, I had heard this quote at the time that everything in life is neutral and only your mind is what creates meaning, good or bad. And it just hit me like a ton of bricks when I heard it, because I would realize that everything I was struggling with, how I felt about my life not working out, or not being where I wanted to be, or I wasn't in the relationship I wanted to be in, or I wasn't making as much money, all this stuff was all coming from within. It was all a story that my mind had created, really without my knowing. It just had created it on autopilot. And because life wasn't matching my internal expectations of life, which again were just made up out of thin air, I realized I was living actually in resistance with reality. I was here thinking life should be one way, and meanwhile life was right here just doing what life does. And so it was this process of learning to still my own mind, to quiet my own mind through things like meditation, right? To turn my awareness inward. and start to be more aware of my own thoughts, my own beliefs, my own aversions, my own desires, my judgments, my criticisms of not just of others, but ultimately of myself. When you get to deeper levels, you see really how it's directed towards yourself. And in that process, I started to understand more and more. I had no idea that I actually had been burying all these emotions my whole life. And now, it's like a pipe that doesn't have an outlet, right? It's just pressurized and it starts leaking out to the side. And what was happening was mine were starting to leak out professionally, personally. I was trying to find outlets through drugs and alcohol. And so this process was almost like a return home, return to myself. I often use the language of like reconnecting with myself, my truest self, my highest self, my best self, if you can think of it that way. And I started to see all the ways in which I was getting in the way of that. Again, things like my beliefs, how I thought things should be. Blaming somebody else for something. Woe is me on a particular situation. Being in a particular circumstance and at the same time not wanting to be in that circumstance. And just the basic framework of that creates so much friction and suffering. And what I found was how much peace was there waiting for me when I started to live in this intimate acceptance with life. Doesn't mean I condone and don't want to improve my life, but what it actually does is it starts at the foundational level and it acknowledges the way things are. It sees reality for what it is versus how I want it to be. And what I had found is the more I was able to do that, the more I was able to quiet my mind, made it easier to do that. And the more I was able to do that, the more I was starting to live a little bit lighter, with a little bit more ease. I was having a little bit more creativity, right? Things were starting to kind of fall in place. And so what I wanted to do on the walk, what the walk was for me, was to really lean into that. Through meditations, I wanted to learn, these walking meditations or mantra. I wanted to be there and be present when my mind, the negativity of my mind came online. When all my shit started to come up, all the stuff I had suppressed for so many years. And there was something amazing about the walk because you're on the road for 6, 7, 8, 12 hours during the day, in this movement, and you're not running. So it takes a while to really get worn down. But after 5 hours or so, you start to physically wear down, which wears down your mental faculties, like your mental defense systems, this ego structure. And it started to just reveal this really raw state. And in that state, a lot of stuff would come up to the surface. Old patterns, old ways of viewing the world, old negative self-thoughts, suppressed sadness, suppressed anger, how much I had been judging myself. How much I hated certain parts of me. And that's exactly what I wanted going into the trip. And I know that probably sounds crazy to a lot of people. But I had already learned that these were the things that were steering the ship behind the curtain, right? I talk a lot about free will with guys I work with. And if we don't go inward and start looking at this stuff, start exploring our fears, start exploring our insecurities, our self-limiting beliefs, because we all have them, right? If we don't intentionally start to look at them and work with them, then those are the things that actually drive our actions on the surface. And if those subconscious things are driving our actions, we're not living with free will. We're living just as a scared human being who is trying to survive and is trying to perfect our outer circumstance and our outer world so it doesn't poke thorns at the parts of us inside that are sensitive. Right? And so knowing that, experiencing that on some level, that's what I wanted to take into the walk and see if I could just blow the top off of it and experience it at as deep of a level as I could even comprehend. And to really sit with a lot of that stuff. And through that process, just practicing being present, I felt things like being one with everything and actually experienced it. Not an intellectual idea, but to experience me in nature, as nature, on this walk, part of everything. Um, and I mentioned earlier with the concept of time and the experience of past and future only existing in our head, and how when we live in that space mentally, how much suffering it creates for us. And so the idea of staying centered, staying still, removing distractions, being right where your feet are, right where your breath are, even in the midst of being in a crazy walk with semi trucks driving by and animals crossing the road and all that stuff. Practicing, no matter what is going on outside of me, I can come back to this center line. And that for me was really the practice every day. And I think, just deepened so many realizations and so many lessons about what really is true for us as human beings in this experience on Earth, and what is all the shit that is layered on top of it that creates suffering in our lives.
Yeah, that's that's very in depth, and I appreciate you mentioning all of that. It's one thing to take a step back in life and realize that transformation, that the sort of, you mentioned earlier in the podcast, the transformation that you go through and the surrender of letting go of a lot of the beliefs and a lot of the limitations that have that hold us all back, or over time, that we kind of that we that we gather over time, that we yeah, that's fascinating. I'd love to know, is there, during that walk, when was there one singular moment, or it could be multiple, but was there one point during that walk where you thought, you know what, this is either a moment where you kind of fell down, you wanted to give up, or a moment where it almost became, I wouldn't say an outer body experience, but you felt like it was more than just walking across, it was more than just a physical event, as you mentioned at the start, as more of a spiritual transformation, almost like I don't want to put words in your mouth, I don't want to feel like it's a pilgrimage or anything, but was there
Yeah.
one point where you felt like this is different, whether you fell down, or whether you, not saying you fell down on the walk at all, whether you felt there was a transform, like a very spiritual moment, or
Yeah, well, so I mentioned in the beginning, one of my core things going into this walk was surrender. And I just had this sense it was going to be really powerful, but I knew it was going to be really challenging. I'd never done that before. I had never, and certainly not to something bigger than me. Um, and what my commitment was to surrender everything, small deals, details, big details. Like, what I found is that it was easier for me to surrender the small convenient stuff than it was the massively big stuff, like me crossing a very narrow 2-lane bridge with cars going 55 miles an hour on each side, or going up this blind canyon with cars, trucks ripping down and there being no shoulder. So some things were easier than others. And I just, like, the most moving thing that happened to me on the walk was seeing how the universe had delivered every single day in the most incredible ways. And some of them were big, some of them make a great story, and others were so small and nobody would think anything of it. You'd be like, yeah, that's just a coincidence. But because I was in that state of letting go completely, trying my best, it wasn't like a one-time thing. It was an effort every day to do that and to really let go. And it wasn't a mental thing, right? It's not really something you do. It's like, it's more of like part of your being. That was also, a big lesson. And so, there were just moments where I'd be on a road somewhere in the middle of the desert, and I'd have 4.5 hours of walking left. It was going to be through the dark. I was out of food. I was out of fuel, and I still had so much left to go. And I'm in the middle of nowhere. Nobody has driven on the road for 30 minutes. And a car passed by, and the car turned around and stopped and asked me if I needed any. He asked if I actually needed a goo pack. Like marathon runners take for energy. And before I could say yes, he's like, hang on. He's like, you look like you're walking somewhere. Let me stop. And he got out and he opened up this huge duffel bag out of his trunk. He was on his way to do a team ultra marathon event from Los Angeles to Las Vegas. And so he had in his bag, in his car, this duffel bag full of endurance gear. So like fuel. So he's throwing like energy bars at me and all this stuff. And it just found me at the most perfect time, 5 minutes before the sun was setting, in the middle of the desert, in this road where nobody was driving. And, you know, on the one day I walked over 50 miles. And he left, and I just had this, you know, I'm like here holding everything on my chest, and it was just this mound of food, specifically for the type of thing I was doing. And what was so amazing is for the rest of the walk, I told myself about every 25 or 30 minutes I would eat something, because I was just so walking on fumes. You know, I was walking for 14, 15 hours that day. And I get to the end of the walk. I make it to where I was staying. I was exhausted. I could barely move that night, barely sleep. I was in so much pain. And I realized that when I woke up in the morning, I had gone through all of the food he gave me. And I didn't plan it that way. And it just so happened he gave me the perfect amount of food to get me through the end of the walk, and just happened to find me in the middle of the desert. So there were things like that that happened that would bring me to tears, or you know, so many things that it's so clear to me is a result in the level of surrender I had. And so to see just how I was taken care of, you know, on the road, and it happened with tornadoes and thunderstorms and all types of stuff that it happened with camping spots in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a highway in New Mexico, like just the things that would just have me stop and look up to the sky and shake my head, you know, just in bewilderment. So yeah, definitely some powerful, not necessarily any one particular thing, but many, many things every single day.
Definitely, yeah. And thanks for sharing, Tim. And if you were to go back and maybe give yourself a piece of advice or maybe a word of wisdom, what would you say? Is there any particular thing that would?
You know, I don't think I don't think anything would have changed my experience. Um, I felt like it was pretty solid beginning to end. Like I needed to learn what I learned when I learned it. Um, Maybe just the reminder that, you know, the phrase I would say to myself is this too, and that's all part of it. You know, the connection with a stranger who stops on the side of the road in the reservation to offer me a banana, people offering their home, and also the challenges, the walking in the wrong direction for 13 miles, the sleeping in thunderstorms and tornado watches, and mentally and emotionally, just feeling so heavy and so much weight during part of it. And just a reminder that it was all part of it. It was all part of the curriculum for me.
Yeah, one big learning experience, it seems. Yeah, definitely,
Yeah.
as you mentioned, part of the curriculum.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I see the keep going on your cap. Was there a phrase that you would tell yourself? You already said. Sorry, are you able to repeat it there, Tim? Sorry, you mentioned us too. What was the
This
phrase?
too.
This
This
too.
too.
Excuse me, this
Yeah.
too. Uh, when you said this too, would that be multiple times on the walk you said that, or is there?
Yeah. Yeah. And what it really means is like, I think sometimes when we go through life, we feel like what we're going through isn't right. Not like morally isn't right, but like, again, we're in that resistance. I shouldn't be here, or I should be over here, or this shouldn't happen to me, or this isn't what I wanted to happen. I worked so hard to get here. I can't believe that it was pulled out from under me. Um, you know, I think of that day, I literally walked 13 miles in the wrong direction, and I had to end up walking almost 40 miles that day. And when I found that out, I wasn't very happy, as you could imagine. And I ended up quickly try, because I still had 26 miles to walk. It didn't matter. I still had to walk that. And so it was a process of saying this too. There are no mistakes, right? We feel like there's a mistake or something's wrong here or there, and it just creates so much suffering within us. And so this too is just a line, is like a recalibration to get me back into acceptance with reality. This is just what happened. Okay. This too is part of it. I can't only want the good, sexy, pleasant stuff and deny all this stuff over here. That's just not how it works. And so saying this too just creates this state of more equanimity to be able to handle both sides without getting so thrown off. And so it was just a phrase anytime there was a challenge, that happened, or, whatever it was. And I would just say that to be like, okay, yeah, that's right. There are no mistakes here. Things aren't going wrong. Like, that's just my mind that's creating the narrative. But actually, truly, the essence of it is like, this is all part of it. And so the more I can get in acceptance with that, the more I can, have a more enjoyable experience on this walk.
Yeah, that's brilliant, Tim. I've never heard that before. This too, sort of letting things happen, and I love the way you said there's no mistakes. There's an element, or there is an acceptance to the whole journey. There's a, yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. And brilliant. Yeah, I think you mentioned the hour, so I don't want to keep you any longer. I think we're 59, 7:59, so, GMT. But yeah, thank you for coming on, Tim. And is there anywhere people can find you? LinkedIn, email, or what's the best way? I know coaching services, I think now, or
Yeah, LinkedIn. LinkedIn's the best. That's where I share most of my stuff. All my links and stuff are there. And then my website is timpereira.com. So first name, last name.com.
okay, brilliant.
Yeah.
Thanks again, Tim, and I appreciate you sharing your story on the podcast today. And I will be uploading this hopefully this evening, if not tomorrow. And yeah,
Cool. Thanks,
brilliant.
Ryan. I appreciate it, man.
Likewise, Tim. Have a good one.
All right, brother.
Thanks for coming on. See you later.
Yep.